Welcome, everyone. This is a joint session we are hosting between the Government Outcome Lab at the University of Oxford and the British Asian Trust. The aim of the session is to share the evidence and the insights on the experience of paying for outcomes in India. There has been a lot of experimentation that has taken place in India in the past few years. India has been one of the innovators launching the first development impact bonds in education. And every year we see new impact bonds coming on the scene. So lots of innovation happening there. And today is our chance to hear from key stakeholders and see what has been learned, what are the challenges, if there is any way forward. My name is Mara Iroldi, and I'm the academic director of the Government Outcome Labs. The Government Outcome Lab is a partnership between the UK government and the University of Oxford. We've been established in 2016, and what we do is focus on what is the role that governments can play to unlock effective cross-sector partnership in order to improve social outcomes. So we did a lot of work on impact bonds, but we actually look at any ways, any instrument that brings several stakeholders around the table to tackle complex social issues. We do so in many ways. We do original research, and we will share some today. We synthesize existing research. We host events like this one and the Social Outcome Conference that is kicking off tomorrow in the main session. Today is the pre-session event. And we also host a large data set of contracts called Indigo. So one can see who is doing what where and reach out to other players in the sector. We engaged with the British Asian Trust from the early days of the Government Outcome Lab, as they are a key stakeholder and innovators in this sector. And as I mentioned, this summer, we joined forces to prepare the event today and also do some original research and take stock on the...
I am like the mother and the grandmother.
Can you please, thank you, keep yourself muted while you are in the session. Today, we are bringing together a cross-section of actors from the ecosystem in India. We have a packed agenda, as you can see here, and it's really the opportunity to distill what are the key insights. We will also hear some new instrument that has been prepared. In particular, Dalber Advisor will present a guide to cost effectiveness that is aimed at policymakers and funders in order to understand how you pay and cost for outcomes in the education sector. As a School of Government, we are particularly glad to have among us so many members of the Indian government and policymakers. As I mentioned at the beginning, our lab and the school in general, the Blavarti School of Government, has a mission to support people like you in accessing relevant evidence and strengthen your capacity. So please do reach out to us after this session and to the school in general. As you can see here, the agenda is very packed. After the introduction by myself and Richard Hawkes, the CEO of British Asian Trust, we will listen to some findings of the research we did this summer. It's only 10 minutes just to set the frame and prompt the discussion. We will then have a 30-minute thought-provoking fire chat conversation on how it is possible or how is it difficult to drive an outcome focus in the development agenda in India. And we will then open the conversation to 3 showcases from stakeholders in India that will go in depth in some of their experiences and distill their key lessons, and we will open up for question and answer. We will close the first part of this morning by welcoming the reflection of Mr. Rajamaran from the Ministry of Finance in India. We will then take a break and we will come to you because we will go in breakout session covering different perspectives, the investor, the funders and bilateral, service provider, the enablers, the researchers, and a really deep dive into what are these players doing and what is the opportunities laying ahead. So just before I hand over to Richard for his welcoming note, please, as you see, the agenda is really packed, so we'll try to stay on time. Ask questions as we go along, use the chat room, and we will bring in your question as soon as it's feasible. And to maintain a pleasant session for everybody, please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. So with no further ado, Richard, and I hand over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Mara. It's a great privilege to be a part of this event, and we're absolutely delighted to be working with you, Mara, and your colleagues at the Government Outcomes Lab. Good afternoon to those of you in India. Good morning to anyone in the UK. And if you're watching from the United States of America, I suggest you go back to bed. I'm Richard Hawkes. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Asian Trust. And it's a great honour for us to be involved in this event, looking at India's experience with paying for outcomes. It's excellent to see so many people joining this event. I've looked through the list, and I do know a good number of you. And whilst it's tremendous to see you virtually at this event, I wish, of course, that we were able to be doing it in person. And I very much wish that I was there in India with so many of you. As those of you who know me know, I love going to India, and because of this damned COVID over the last 18 months, I haven't been able to go for such a long time. Of course, there's only one outcome that most people in India really want, and that is to beat England at cricket. So I'm delighted for all of you that India seem to be achieving that so easily at the moment. But hopefully, let's see if things can turn around later this week. For more than 10 years, the British Asian Trust has been at the forefront of innovative developments in India and across the whole of the South Asian region. We were set up and we're driven by the Indian and South Asian diaspora. And they want to see innovation, they want to see success, they want to see cost effectiveness, and they want to see impact at scale. And for those reasons, a number of years ago, we embraced social finance and outcomes-based financing. And led by my brilliant colleagues, Abha Torat Shah and Salim Khan, we have become real pioneers in this space in India and across South Asia. We believe that events like this one are an excellent way of learning and of bringing people together to keep the momentum going in this space. I'd especially like to thank GoLabs, who I've mentioned already, and all other stakeholders, including the World Bank, the British government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the UBS Optimus Foundation, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, Dahlberg, the Impact Investors Council, BCG and Asha Impact for their contributions to the agenda for the event. And thank you also to all the presenters who've also been working with us to plan today's agenda and programme. As I said, we at the British Asian Trust have a deep commitment to this approach, and our commitment is matched by our desire to drive evidence and learning in the sector so that we can learn both from successes and also from failures. We're aware that India has led several innovations in this area, and you'll be discussing them today. What is critical is that the sector now builds on this innovation to really drive scale and impact. I'm here to open the event and hand over to all of you to discuss, debate, and engage with a blueprint for scale to drive bigger and greater engagement on paying for social outcomes in education, health, skills, water, sanitation, and other crucial fields. We hope that the next few hours provide the platform to do just that, and that you all come away energized, enthused, and excited by the potential of this work. We hope that our global participants take away learnings from our Indian colleagues that might also be applicable to their own contexts. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today and for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the British Asian Trust. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to my colleague, Abha Torat Shah.
Thank you, Richard. And like everyone else, I'm going to keep time. Welcome to so many friends and so many partners. And thank you, Go Labs, for bearing with us. Hopefully the Indians rock this event and give the Go Labs the sort of energy that we take away as the British Asian Trust from our colleagues. So this is about India and for India. So really, really excited. Just a little bit, a small sort of housekeeping piece. My colleagues and team will be on the chat, putting out links, bits of evidence, documents explaining key terms. So this is not a 101 on impact bonds or outcomes-based financing. If you need that, the chat function will do that. This is about taking it to the next step. So do keep an eye on the chat function. As I talk about something, there will be a link from an Ecoris report or a piece at Brookings or somewhere else or at Go Labs themselves, which will be helpful to deepen that your understanding and thinking. So we'll try and make that happen while we take the conversation into where we want to take it, which is what comes next. I'm really delighted to be joined by Tanya, who led on this research. I'm just setting the scene for her to tell you what's happened in India for the last 6 years. For those, most of us do know, but this is just to take a recap. And Tanya, who has interviewed several stakeholders in the market, will actually share and synthesize the findings. Once we do that, we'll hand over to Maitri to open the event, the opening session. But first, if I could have the first slide, that would be great. So we will talk about the evolution of the Indian outcome financing market very quickly. All the early adopters, I think almost all of you are in this room. And then Tanya will go into the what. So, why have you guys got involved? What has happened? What have you learned? What challenges? And then we'll sort of pick out the kinds of themes we want to talk about during the next few hours with you. Moving forward, so just taking a sort of step back into history, not a very long history, 6 years or so, Educate Girls, trailblazers in our country with the first impact bond in the world. And what they did for us is set that sort of blueprint of what happens to a service provider when a funder spends time paying for outcomes, the kind of flexibility it brings, the way it drives change. And the story of Educate Girls has been told many times, so I won't go in, but I did want to pause for a minute and recognize the efforts they took in the global market to do this. On the back of that, several bigger transactions came quickly on in 2018. Quality Education India did, Krish did in health, VI in education, both with hundreds and thousands of participants in them. And as we have these impact bonds, we also had other pay for success programs. MS Michael and Susan Dell Foundation leading with on Varthana, the impact linked debt structure, the first RBF with Social Finance India, SBI in using CSR funding in Haryana. Colleagues are here from there. And coming up very soon, a colleague from NSDC here, the National Skills Development Corporation on the Skill India Impact Bond. So the market has steadily grown. Just a few points on this. I think there are 15 odd outcome funders involved in this market right now. While 3 impact bonds qualify to make it here, we would involve all these structures in this market. And the market continues to grow. Moving forward, just a quick note on, how does that compare to the rest of the world? So globally, there are around 200 impact bonds. You can see that's against United Kingdom, which is 88. Here, the government plays a key critical role. The Indian experience, as everybody knows, is service provider, intermediary, or funder-led, not yet government-led. And then Colombia, which is a developing country context, which is completely driven from within a unit in government. So very different experience from India, all employment focused. Something to note is that across the world, employment and training seems to be a top area for impact bonds, though health, education come a close second. And Laura has put a link in to the data set on the Go Labs website, where you can actually go in and compare data in any way you want, by investment, by funds raised, by number of beneficiaries, whatever you want, it's out there for you to look and read up. So when you take a step into the who's in the market, who are these people and what's the market driven by? Currently, it's driven by several of us. And I think like a good impact bond, it's never one partner who does it. I'll start with our service providers. We do have the best of best in class in our country across sectors. So we've got their names there. We've got several technical partners. And here I'm talking about the research partners, our evaluators, our performance managers, our lawyers, who are all driving this work with us. And then you have the funders who not just back the outcome funding, but also some of the technical work that is required. USAID, FCDO come to mind. And in outcome funding, several leading the game. UBS Optimus, of course, you have to name as the top investor who's been thinking about the Indian market, really driving it. And the Dell's coming a close party to that. And of course, as the market has grown, we are now seeing a huge flurry of CSR funders super excited about this and recent regulations opening up. In the investors, similarly, Asha Impact, Kaizenvest, and in service providers with the Skill India Impact Bond, several skilling service providers joining the game, and new research partners, new technical partners joining us. So the market is growing, and it's this, if anything, this shows you that India has always had the ingredients to do this well. The question is, how have they all worked together, and what has enabled them to do that? Moving forward to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Tanya to set the scene for how we did the research with all these early adopters mostly, and then where their key drivers to participate in these transactions.
Great, thank you so much, Ava. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Hamid, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate at the Government Outcomes Lab. Really great to be joining you here today and to be sharing a bit more about the emerging insights from our research with the British Asian Trust. As Mara mentioned, India is a really exciting opportunity for us. There's lots to learn there. And so our objective with this research was really to capture some of the key insights that are coming out from the key stakeholders in the market, and to really use these to draw out broader learnings, both for the LMIC context, but also the broader outcomes-based financing context. And so this led us to 4 main research questions. So firstly, what does the landscape look like? Who's involved and how is this evolving? And this is something that Ava's already covered. And now we're speaking a bit more about the remaining 3 questions, which for us were, what is the rationale for using these new tools instead of traditional tools such as grants or activity-based payments? What have been the key learnings and challenges so far? And indeed, what are some of the future trends that we are seeing, especially in terms of scaling and sustaining impact through these tools? And we thought the best people to speak to for this would be the experts themselves. So we've been speaking to all the sort of key stakeholders in the market through in-depth interviews, also an extensive survey. And today we'll be sharing some of the key findings that are emerging out of this. We hope that these are not treated as conclusions, but instead as a prompt and as a foundation for the rest of the discussion. So just to start off, one of the first things that we asked stakeholders was why they got involved in the first place. So why use outcomes-based financing in India? And here we spoke to a range of stakeholders. So we spoke to outcome funders, investors, service providers, and actors in the public sector. And so of course, all of them come from slightly different places and have slightly different reasons to be involved. But one of the key threads that we saw across all of these stakeholders is to drive a focus on better outcomes. So better outcomes in health, in education, in employment, and across different policy areas. There's a lot here, and due to lack of time, I won't be able to go into all of this. Some of the other things that stood out were also incentives to drive efficiency in public spending, to foster new partnerships with government, to scale up successful services or interventions, and also to develop new investment structures. And to back all of this and to enable some of this, again, there were a range of things that came out, but a couple that really stood out to me were firstly, a pool of very competent and experienced service providers who were willing to work in this new way, and also a pool of local intermediaries and conveners who were able to really bring in sector knowledge and provide the right technical support to get these projects to launch. And then we asked stakeholders also about their sort of emerging lessons or reflections from all of this. It's still relatively early days, and a lot of projects haven't published the final results yet, as they're still in implementation, but stakeholders are beginning to see some clear sort of advantages and reasons to be using outcomes-based financing. So firstly, they think that these can help shift the focus to outcomes and impacts instead of activities and inputs, so really focusing on what's meaningful and long-term in terms of impact, rather than focusing on the number of schools built or the amount of funding or the number of people engaged. And in addition to that, people also spoke about greater collaboration coming through amongst the stakeholders. So again, sort of galvanized by these common goals, these common outcomes, but also the opportunity to work with new people, both internally and externally, and to work quite closely together, both in the development stage as well as the implementation stage, and to really sort of drive things forward together. There's also an opportunity to strengthen independent monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems. A lot of people spoke about new data systems, particularly around data collection, data analysis, and also reporting some of this impact. People saw more innovation happening, particularly in services and also the use of blended finance. This is again facilitated by the increased flexibility that the tool seems to provide for service providers. And this is particularly crucial in adapting services to COVID-19 in very creative ways, particularly when it came to using digital tools, using remote monitoring, and many other innovative means. But we also asked stakeholders about some of the key challenges that they're facing. And here we group these into sort of three main sets. So the first sort of group of challenges was around design and development. So people spoke about high transaction costs or building some of these tools and getting some of these projects off of the ground, the protracted design and development timelines that are often involved, and also defining the right outcomes metrics and outcome prices. So for instance, really trying to establish what is meaningful, what is measurable, and also what is the right sort of risk assessment around some of these things, which can often be quite subjective or interpreted differently across different stakeholders. And then there's an additional barrier that there's a lack of templates for program design and delivery at the moment, which makes some of this even more tricky. The second set of challenges was around convening diverse stakeholders. So as we know, there can be a large number of stakeholders involved in any of these projects. Sometimes it can be difficult to align those and bring them all together. But at the same time, service providers also spoke about perhaps being able to play a more active role in the future and being able to come in a bit earlier during the design process and input more actively. They also spoke about potential opportunities for more cross-sectoral and peer learning. And some stakeholders thought that there was potentially low risk appetite among local investors who sometimes prefer to work in more traditional ways and use more traditional models for investment. So these two sets of challenges are fairly universal in this space. And so these are challenges we hear very often in the UK, in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. But the thing that really stood out to me was the sort of regulatory and legal set of challenges, which do seem to be quite prominent in India. And that to me is just a symptom of being a really nascent space. So this is something that does need to evolve in order to facilitate outcomes-based financing structures and to facilitate more blended finance instruments in the future. And again, a lack of templates for some of the contracts and legal documents is an additional barrier and perhaps something that we can all work towards together. This is just the last slide I'm going to cover now, which is around the way forward. So we asked stakeholders what the future looks like. So what does it mean in terms of scaling and sustainability? And for the most part, stakeholders thought that outcomes-based financing definitely has a role to play in India and is here to stay. But in order to scale it, government buy-in participation is really, really crucial. And so the most obvious role that the government can play in driving the scale is as an outcomes funder, but at the same time, this will require more partnerships to be built, more technical support to be provided to government. And so part of that is sharing more performance data and contracts, developing the right templates and frameworks. And so while government buy-in is necessary, wider market growth and evolution also is a necessary complement to this. And this can again take many different forms, whether that's the development of market institutions and independent research centers to really enable some of this data sharing and knowledge sharing to take place. Also the development of monitoring and evaluation frameworks, potentially the development of outcomes funds to pool some of this funding and simplify legal structures. This is something we've seen a lot of in the UK. So most of the impact bonds in this country have been driven by outcomes funds led by central government. And these have also been able to then encourage local governments to get involved and really scale up the tool. In addition, some other things that we need to perhaps do in terms of sustaining impact is to keep building local capacity. So there's already a great pool of service providers and technical partners, but to keep building some of this local capacity. And finally, to have clearer exit strategies. So what happens when a project ends? How do we sustain the impact? What does this mean for the sector, for India, and for individual organizations? So that's everything I wanted to share, and I'm going to hand it back to Aba now. I hope some of this can be helpful and can drive the discussion forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm here to just say thanks to Tanya for sort of synthesizing what was several hours and hours of research from her and her colleagues. I'm going to hand over to Maitri in a minute, but a few prompts for discussion from what Tanya has said. One, which is what can this evidence or the learnings or what you're hearing from the market help India scale these approaches? And I'm sure Maitri will pick up many of these points coming up. What does this evidence mean for the world? What does this evidence mean for India? How do we work together to actually address some of the challenges that have come up as part of discussions? So with that, and given we really want to focus on this session, I'm handing over to Dr. Maitri Das, who is the practice manager at World Bank. She also heads GPRBA, which is the Global Partnership for Results-Based Approaches. Maitri is is brilliant. She's from India, and I think she's going to lead a stimulating session with our two brilliant speakers, Mr. Amitabh Kant, from Chief Executive Officer of Niti Aayog, who you all know, and our own Adil, who is the chairman of the Quality Council of India, friend to the British Asian Trust and several partners here, also very, very well versed in impact bonds, more than any of us put together. So welcome Amitabh and Adil, and Maitri, over to you.
Thank you so much, Abha. Real pleasure to be here, especially with this August panel that I have the great opportunity of moderating. It's called a fireside chat. The only allusion to fireside is how hot it is outside here in Jaipur, where I'm joining from. So Mr. Amitabh Kant, Mr. Zainul Bhai, real pleasure to be here and to moderate this discussion again. I just wanted to start by setting the stage very briefly and drawing upon what Tanya and Abha have already talked about. I think there's no doubt about the fact that India is emerging or has emerged as the crucible for the most incredible innovations in outcomes-based financing. And this is not something that happened suddenly. It's been an incremental process. It's been a process of experimentation. It's been a process of innovation that India has probably over the last several decades honed to this point. Now, outcomes-based financing is considered as something new. It is and it isn't. I think issues around results-based financing, manner in which results-based financing has emerged over time is not new. I mean, not just India, but the world over, there have been performance-based contracts, there have been pay for success, there have been ways in which payments have been linked to results in many different ways. We talked about impact bonds, but in fact, and here I'm going to tell you very briefly about what the World Bank does. And at the World Bank, we have an instrument called Program for Results. And the basic premise of a program for results is that you pay based on the achievement of an outcome. And that is essentially what a program for results is. The largest program for results, probably the largest results-based financing anywhere in the world, is Swachh Bharat. So Swachh Bharat is a mechanism by which you have, or rather it is a payment mechanism by which disbursements are linked to actual achievement of preordained, independently certified results. So all this to say that while this is not something new, outcomes-based financing in the form of impact bonds is something that is still emerging on the development landscape, and India is a first mover on that. So there's no doubt about that. So I have before me two policymakers, persons who are very, very influential in moving the public sector agenda in terms of outcomes-based financing, because we know this for a fact. And someone mentioned that we've had 3 impact bonds in India over the last 3 years, amounting to $20 million. $20 million is nothing. It's nothing for India. We can only go to scale with impact bonds or with outcomes-based financing as a generic instrument if the public sector is involved. And if the public sector is a pair, not just a pair of outcomes, but an entity that is engaged in ways that are even more deep than they currently are. So let me start with you, Mr. Kant, and for my audience who will think that I'm being a bit too formal, once an IAS officer, always an IAS officer, I will have to call my panelists sir. There's no getting away from it. So Mr. Amitabh Kant is my senior from the Indian Administrative Service, and so sir, one of the things that you have been talking a lot about is outcomes. And at the Niti Aayog, you have been focusing on outcomes. You have been focusing on aspirational districts and the manner in which outcomes can be not just deepened, but measured. So can you tell us a little bit about what the aspirational districts are and about how you are thinking in terms of outcomes and their financing? Over to you, sir.
So let me first say that Niti Aayog is the Government of India's think tank. It's developed itself as a state-of-the-art resource center. And we have been driving an outcome-based agenda through the Development Monitoring Evaluation Organization, what we call as the DMEO, and the Aspirational District Program, The aspirational districts program covers the most backward districts of India, 112 of them. They are backward in terms of their performance, in terms of their geographical location, but we don't call them backward, we call them the aspirational districts of India. And we monitor their performance on 49 outcomes, and we measure them on real-time data. And we put their ranking out in public domain, and on the basis of their performance, we award the best performing districts on a monthly basis. And in the aspirational districts program, data is the basic foundation. And this is the world's largest initiative in results-based governance. It reaches out to about 250 million people in 112 aspirational districts across India. Every month, these districts are ranked on the progress they have made on key indicators and health and nutrition outcomes, on education, on basic infrastructure, agriculture, financial inclusion. And this has led to improved outcomes verified on a real-time data by independent agencies like the Institute of Competitiveness of Michael Porter, and also through an independent study brought out by UNDP in its recent report as a very successful model for local area development. In addition to this, the DMEO, the Monitoring and Evaluation Organization, has been mandated to actively monitor and evaluate the implementation of schemes, program, and initiatives of the Government of India based on outcomes to strengthen their implementation and scope of delivery on an ongoing basis. And through the outcome monitoring framework, the OOMF framework, clear outcomes have been defined for all government schemes. The first OOMF document was presented in Parliament in 2017-18, and since then this has been a regular feature of the budget documents. It has led to enhancing transparency and accountability. It has led to improved outcomes verified by independent agencies, and to strengthen the output and outcome tracking, logical framework is now mandatory in all government schemes now before approval. So before any scheme gets approved, there has to be an outcome and output framework and how it will be tracked down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We find ourselves right now in the midst of a crisis that we had never conceived of. And COVID-19 has kind of stood a lot of initiatives on its head. Where do you see, for instance, the aspirational districts, but B, and perhaps more importantly to the context of this discussion, where do you see outcomes monitoring and payment for outcomes actually moving, given this incredible moment that we find ourselves in?
The pandemic has laid bare the need to invest in healthcare and education systems, very, very critical to improve health outcomes and learning outcomes. Actually, the pandemic has impacted these two sectors in a very big manner. While the allocations towards health and education expenditure have been rising, it's not the expenditure, the challenges of good governance and the challenges of improving outcomes in health and education. And we are still short of the desired targets. And I'm a long-term believer that India has to do well in education, health, and nutrition to be able to grow on a sustained basis over a long period of time. And while India has done well in achieving access to primary schools, the time is now to, it's not about access, it's about improving learning outcomes. And apart from enhancing financing, innovative models of service delivery are needed to enhance outcomes in these areas. And models for partnership between public, private sector will be needed. This is very critical because while we've developed this partnership with private sector and physical infrastructure projects, now is the time that the private sector must embrace these initiatives in building India's social infrastructure. In the education sector, Niti Aayog is collaborating with the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation in partnership with the Department of School Education and Literacy. We are piloting a project in 4 districts of Uttar Pradesh: Sonbhadra, Fatehpur, Chandauli, and Balrampur. And the objective of this project is to improve the learning outcomes of students from grade 3 to 8 in these districts. And this is about 3 years project, and the students from grade 3 to 8 across 279 schools in these 4 districts will be benefit from this project. And this project will be the first of its kind in the country of the government, in the government of India, wherein outcome-based funding, it's all impact-based funding concept will be applied. We are inviting a service partner to implement an intervention to improve learning outcomes, and a portion of the funding to the service partner will be given once the outcome targets of the intervention are achieved. It is a new approach to social service delivery and unique financing model to achieve the desired outcome. In aspirational district program, we award the best performing districts on a monthly basis. We give about 10 crores to the best performing district and 5 crores to the second best performing district. And we award 5 crores based on real-time data ranking. And we believe in ranking, we believe in naming and shaming. But this program that I talked about with the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, we are doing impact-based funding. That is only when the service partner will implement and will give us the desired learning outcome, the funding to the service partner will take place. And therefore, this is, if it succeeds, we'll take it forward in many other districts of India. So this is really the key way forward to push both outcomes and push impact funding in many of our districts.
Thanks very much, sir. And you've already spoken about the ways in which the public sector, the state, can not just create an enabling environment, but actually commission outcomes. And that's a very powerful thing you've just said. What would you say to people who believe that it is the preeminent responsibility of the state to provide services? That this is privatization through the back door, or that the role of the private sector is being enhanced more than needed, especially during COVID. I realize this is a provocative question, but no one better than you to answer it.
I'm a believer that state will continue to have an important role to play. But that does not mean that the private sector or the civil society will not have an important role to play. Both have to. The government will have to be a facilitator, will have to be a catalyst. It'll have to involve both the civil society and the private sector. In fact, it'll have to structure projects in a very transparent manner to and invite private sector. In fact, by focusing explicitly on outcomes, efficiencies are driven, as financing would directly be linked to results. And this is important, that all financing must be linked to performance and to outcome results. This aligns the incentives across the entire chain to achieve the desired outcomes. I'm a believer that the involvement of the private sector and civil society in monitoring and evaluation of these approaches can validate the results being reported, bringing in much greater level of accountability and transparency. And this is the approach we have followed in the aspirational district program, and it has yielded us very, very much the desired results. Impact bonds and RBF will bring innovations in services delivery and outcomes achievements that can provide lessons, insights for wider application across the government. In all my career, right from the beginning, whether I've worked for community development in Kerala or with the fisheries sector in Kerala, or the aspirational districts program in Government of India, I've been a long-term believer that outcomes are the key. Convergence of departments is important, but bringing in private sector and civil society to deliver results is far more important. And all these have to converge and integrate.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me now come to you, Mr. Zainul Bhai. Just to start with, and we've been on a previous panel together, and your connection both with QEI as well as with innovative financing instruments towards the social sector are very well known. You talked very passionately about EdTech being the next frontier, if the frontier isn't already there. Could you tell us a little bit about the manner in which you have engaged with the QEI, but also the Capacity Building Commission, because it's a real moment that we have here to really do the technical assistance and the capacity building. So if I can turn to you to give us a bit of an intro to that, please.
Sure, happy to do that, and very happy to be on this panel with Amitabh and with BAT. So I think the broad point that I would raise here is that I think there is a lot of innovation going on in thinking in terms of delivery of government services and delivery of services to the Indian citizen and to improving the quality of life. The Prime Minister has said many times that our civil servants are often not equipped and trained to deliver the quality of services that we would like them to deliver to our citizens. And therefore we need to build their capacity so that they can in fact deliver those services. And so there's a lot of innovation going on in sort of the HR of the Indian civil service, which by the way comprises of something like 20 million people across state, local and urban local bodies and states and central, which is a very large number. And the question is, how can you think of innovative and different structures and ways to improve the capability of civil servants to deliver these services? And I think that is going to spark a huge amount of innovation. There are two major changes that the Prime Minister has already started, and I think there's several more coming. One of them is the setting up of what is called Mission Karma Yogi, which is really lifelong learning for every civil servant, and a platform on which to deliver that digitally, which I think when it is set up will be the most advanced platform in the world for providing training for civil servants. The Capacity Building Commission's job is to think about what are all the ways in which we can change so that we can deliver the right sets of tools and the right sets of training and the right sets of capabilities for civil servants to deliver what they're trying to do. And that ties into, I think, the discussion that we're having. We're looking at many things. For example, there are 700 central training institutes, not even counting states or urban local bodies training institutes in India. And we are not coordinating across those. Many of them are teaching the same courses, and there's little coordination between them. And the quality of all of those can be raised dramatically if they work together, and therefore you can train a large number of people. So how do you reform the entire training institutions and the entire training infrastructure in India to provide that training? The second part, of course, is iGOT, which is the Indian government digital training platform that is going to come out, which when it does, as it's just about to roll out, and when it gets started, it will be among the most advanced, it will be the most advanced such platform in the world. And it'll allow each individual to really think about training for themselves and how to improve training over the years. So I think there is a lot going on with that. And now I'd like to, and we are just getting started on the Capacity Building Commission. So I'll turn it over to you, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that have been happening on direct impact loans.
Thank you so much. And you know, this is extremely helpful just to set the context in terms of where capacities need to be built and towards what. I think it's the capacity, it's towards what that is extremely important, and you alluded to that. But let me not speak anymore, and let me hand it back to you, Mr. Zainul Bhai. Give us a sense of the connections that you have had with the QEI, with the Quality Council of India, and issues around quality of service delivery. And I think that this issue of quality of service delivery, not just actually getting from point A to point B, but what happens in between point A and point B, that quality element of it, If you could reflect a bit on that, but also reflect a bit on the connections that you have had with QEI and with EdTech, and where do you see that going, especially in our current context?
So let me start out by building a little bit on what Amitabh said about outcomes-based. I think there is a huge appetite for thinking about the delivery of outcomes in terms of services for the Indian citizen, whether it's in education, healthcare, Swachh. Swachh, I think, was one of the great examples of a huge success that we've had. And everything is linked to outcomes. And I think 3 or 4 things are necessary to do that. Number one, we have to have the ability to measure that data. And in the past, we've not had the ability to do that. Lots of data is suspect in India, and it's very tough to have an outcomes-based system where the data is suspect, right? So how do you pay on outcomes if you don't know whether the data was accurate? So I think a lot of very good work is being done and a lot of innovations in collecting data. I think what NITI has done in terms of aspirational districts, and I think Amitabh mentioned 43, that they're measuring on 43 or 49 variables. The innovations in data collection and data cleaning up and doing it in real time are actually quite amazing. Very few countries are able to do it at that level across a population base of 230 million in these aspirational districts. So one, we need very good data to do that. Second is most of the execution of that, of improving quality of services, is done by, I would say, people on the ground. Government civil servants on the ground who are citizen facing are actually doing a lot of the implementation, helped by NGOs, helped by other government ministries, etc. And I think even in aspirational districts and in Swachh, there was a huge need to train them on certain things. I remember Param Iyer, who was the secretary heading the Swachh program. You mentioned that was one of the biggest programs where the World Bank funded it based on outcomes. They had to train literally 100,000 Swachh workers in 2 weeks period to teach them what is it that we expect. These are government workers and volunteers. At one point, they had to train thousands of not district administrators, but block officers, principals, healthcare workers on what does Swachh mean and what should they do. And it wasn't just a question of saying, do this. You had to give them the skills and train them to do it. And they had to design training systems to do that. Today, if we do a good job on the Capacity Building Commission and with IGOT, which is the digital training platform, we will be able to do all of that much, much easier and be able to deliver that training so that, in fact, you can deliver the service. The idea is not just to train people for the sake of training, but that, in fact, it delivers that service. So if I go back to how do you get outcomes, one, you have to have good data to measure it. Two, a huge number of people are involved in delivering outcomes. Even in the work that I've been involved with on education, on direct impact bonds, it required a lot of training of teachers, of principals, and others. It required a lot of outreach to parents. Quite a lot of that was being done by service providers and NGOs. But without that training, you couldn't actually deliver on all of that. And that's one of the big bottlenecks that we see, is both the government structure at the local level as well as training, and how do you do that? And the third part of it that I think Amitabh mentioned, and I just want to stress again, is, see, compared to 15 years ago, India is at a very interesting crossroads in terms of its technology capability. If you look at some of the breakthroughs in high tech, India has now got the third largest number of unicorns, a huge 50,000 startups. It is sort of the third largest, it gets the third largest amount of venture capital. And there's a huge amount of innovation going on in technology. And so the idea is, can we leapfrog by using that incredible technology capability in India to, in fact, deliver on outcomes faster than we would have if we had done it in the standard way? So I think all of this comes together: innovation in financing, innovation in technology that allows you to measure, innovation in technology that allows you to train at a very large scale level. And you put many of those things together, and now you have the ability to do change at a very large level, at a very, very, very large scale. We call it population scale programs, right? And the idea now in all of this, which I think Amitabh coined this phrase, so I'm shamelessly borrowing it from him, is we want things to work at startup speed at population scale. And I think you're right. What we're doing in direct impact bonds and others is relatively small. But I think now we have the confidence to try things at population scale. I mean, to have aspirational district program at 230 million people that are affected is a population scale program, and only possible because of continual innovation in technology, continual innovation in training, continual innovation in financing. Thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, I think that, we've had a really short period of sort of rapid fire kind of a round with the two of you. And my instant takeaway from what you both said is you're thinking scale. I mean, scale of the kind that globally no one else can think of except India for obvious reasons. So first is scale. A second is incentives. So what both you, Mr. Amitabh Kant, as well as Mr. Zainul Bhai, you said, is that there are now increasing incentives to be able to deliver in certain ways. And those incentives are predetermined and identified. Okay, that's the second one. A third one, which is extremely important, is data. Now data, and I'm hoping that data will lead to open data, which it already is in many, many different ways, but increasing open data. Finally, technology and training. So those are sort of my few takeaways from it, but I'm going to let you both have the last word. Give me one idea, not necessarily one idea as a single idea, but one thought, one reflection of where do you see this going in the COVID context? Because I don't know that we are going to ever see a post-COVID world that was the way it was before. So in the new world that's going to be hopefully after COVID, where do you see this outcomes-based financing going? Mr. Kant.
Data is really the key. And when I was a district collector in Kerala, one never knew whether the district was moving up or down. Data which was coming in was published data coming 6 to 7 years afterwards. So all the indicators, I didn't know how my district Calicut in Kerala was performing vis-a-vis other districts of Kerala or vis-a-vis other districts of India. But today, technology and particularly mobile telephony has enabled you to get data on a real-time basis, compare districts, compare blocks, compare villages, put that data on outcome basis and rank performances, put it in public domain, let everybody know how those blocks are performing, how those districts are performing, name and shame them. And once people get to know whether their districts or states are not performing, a huge sense of competitive federalism will come in. And that's what we've done with ease of doing business. We have named and shamed states. First year we did it, Gujarat came number 1. Next year, Andhra beat Gujarat. Third year, Telangana beat Andhra and Gujarat. But the good thing was that, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, which are, which were ranking 25th and 26th, they came 4th and 5th. And my belief is that the eastern part of India improves, the rest of India improves. And therefore, starting with data, we need to now focus on outcomes in a very big way. The government is still too much dependent on financial and physical achievements. We should move away from it to outcomes and then move to impact-based funding. Every scheme of government must have a service partner, must have impact-based funding, and only on delivery of those outcomes should fund flow take place. And that should be a clear priority for the government. And that will lead to radical transformation in learning outcome. That will lead to radical transformation in health outcomes. In fact, government must consciously tell the government officers also who are working in the field that a certain component of their salary will depend on enhancement of learning outcomes and health outcomes. That will challenge them to do transformation on the ground level and start putting out this data in public domain. So we put out data of states' performance on health index, on education index, on water management index, all this. And now we've put out the data of 120 districts of the Northeast and how they perform out in public index. And we'll soon be putting out data relating to the performance of district hospitals in public domain. And every citizen of India must hold his elected representative, his government officer responsible for delivery of outcomes.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's a perfect roundup of what we've been trying to speak about. Mr. Zainul Bhai, last word.
I think in what I'd say is let me end with the word confidence, and let me tell you what I mean by that. During COVID, I think we realized several things that I think allow us to move forward with confidence on a whole series of areas. One is we realize that when we get our minds to it, we can in fact do breakthroughs in technology at population scale, that we can in fact deliver outcomes when everything is pointed together and we're all getting all the systems aligned. And so I think going forward, there is actually a great sense of confidence that we can get many things done. And that by getting the right data, by getting the right technology and getting the right incentives, we will be able to make a big difference. And I think so that is actually, one of the things coming out of this. And I'll give you as an example, the incredible success of the CoWIN app in India, which was developed in a very short time, and is now handling over 500 million people on it. And it keeps track of everybody's vaccination. And in the next phase, every RT-PCR test done in India will be linked to a person on the CoWIN app. So that you just have to carry around the CoWIN app and you can see every test that has ever been done certified. That has given, I think, a lot of confidence to say that we can move very quickly and link things to outcomes. And so I think there's confidence that we can take on large-scale transformation programs and move ahead. So I think the combination of, as I said, data, technology, training, and civil service capability, I think will allow us to move forward in a very large way. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just end by thanking you both profusely. My takeaway is the slogan, startup speed at population scale. I'm going to be using it shamelessly and wanted to say thank you very much.
But you have to thank Amitabh, who has the copyright on it.
I'm telling him that I'm going to be using it and I'm going to use it shamelessly. Absolutely, sir. And so thank you so much to you both.
No, you can use it. You can definitely use it shamelessly as long as you give credit.
That's exactly what Mr. Zainul Bhai is saying. I will absolutely use it and give credit, no doubt about that. So thanks very much, sir. Thanks, Mr. Zainul Bhai. Thank you to ABBA and the British Asian Trust, as well as Go Labs. Great pleasure to be here. Over to you, back to you, ABBA.
Wow, how can one follow up that act, the chemistry as well as the insights? Thank you so much, all three of you. I was energized and I'm sure the market was. This is how our policymakers are. You haven't heard our service providers yet. They will really, really blow your minds. So they are coming up, but from policy to practice. I've got three brilliant partners from India now presenting. We have asked them to present TED style, which means we'll be keeping time and the clock ticking at the background. Now we're moving from sort of policy to evidence. Where is the evidence coming out of these early innovations really driving that scale conversation that policymakers are asking us? What can we do with this evidence that goes beyond individual transactions? I am not going to individually introduce my colleagues, but starting with the Dalberg team, we're going to start in the space of education, moving into health with Ellen, and then moving to skills with Arun and Avneet. We will spend 5 minutes each learning from policy, from practical insights as to how we are taking these scale conversations on the ground. So Dayong and Gagan, huge welcome to you, and really looking forward to this tool, which I know you've been wanting to launch, and several partners here have been part of. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Abba. Krisha, can we pull up the slides? Wonderful. Or maybe Gagan. Hi, everyone. Wonderful, thank you. So my team at Dalberg has been managing the performance of the Quality Education India DIB for the past 3 years, which has been serving over 200,000 students across India. And the DIB has been performing phenomenally well, as Sudhirji also put on the chat, and has been incredibly resilient through COVID times. Now, as we were entering this final year, we wanted to take a step back and reflect on all of this rich data we've collected to learn about what can really be useful for the rest of the outcomes-based financing ecosystem, and especially for the education sector in India. And so the first question we asked ourselves is one where we get asked a lot, which is whether the additional transaction costs, right, all the measurement costs, for example, we talked about a lot, involved in a mechanism like this really worth it when you look at the outcomes gained. The second question we asked is how much should learning outcomes really cost in the context of India? We realized that there's not a lot of widespread agreement on this question, which is a real barrier to scaling outcomes-based contracts because outcome prices then need to be renegotiated every time. And third, we wanted to inform what types of interventions are really worth investing in so that resources in the future can go to interventions that have actually shown to be cost-effective. And so in response to the very first question, the QEI experience really clearly showed that the costs were well worth it. The DIB achieved over 50% more outcomes relative to the same interventions by the same providers under grant-based models. And we found that surprisingly, while there were sizable transaction costs, the unit cost per child wasn't actually higher because it went through rounds of negotiations through the process and actually became quite lean. And some of the reasons for why we saw higher results included a lot of the patterns we've already discussed, greater accountability, given there's a real potential for financial loss, more flexibility and innovation, given inputs and activities are not prescribed in advance, more emphasis on monitoring evaluation, which really allows for frequent program learnings and improvements. And we found that these advantages need not be just in the impact bond context. There are lots of different tools like performance-based bonuses or penalties that can be smartly incorporated into different contracting mechanisms. In response to our second question, from looking at the QEI data and over 20 other high quality program evidence, we found that additional 1,000 to 3,000 rupees, which is 13 to 40 bucks, per child can lead to one additional year of learning gains for high quality interventions, which is only about 5 to 15% of government expenditure per child at schools. And so this can be a really useful guidance for educational providers to target and for future funders to expect. I'll pass it on to Gagan now for the final insight.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dayang. So I am now going to take a few minutes and walk you through our findings related to the third question that Dayang mentioned earlier. That is, what type of education interventions to invest in. So as we know, the current context is that the schools have been closed for almost 1.5 years now. And in these last 1.5 years, there is growing evidence that students have lost out on foundational skills due to COVID-19. But despite these nationwide losses, what we found from our QEI experience is that interventions that successfully combine physical and digital components, that is, phygital models, they have shown to achieve meaningful gains even during the lockdown. So even in that 6 odd months of intervention that they were able to do, these models were able to achieve about 33% of the gains in a typical government school setting, in a pre-COVID sort of an era. And that's because both the digital and the physical models, they have their own unique value proposition. While the digital models allow for intervention even during lockdown, the physical models can not only help enhance the reach for students that don't have those devices, but they are also much better for engagement. SARD, for example, which is an education NGO, was able to increase the reach by almost 20%, complementing both the sort of things. So that's what do you do during lockdown, right? But the next question is, what do we do when students come back to schools, right? So what's going to happen is that the learning levels of the students are going to be lesser than before, and there is going to be much more heterogeneity amongst those learning levels as well. Right? So therefore, we need to be much more intentional about what sort of interventions do we really choose. And over here, what really becomes important are 3-4 different interventions, again coming from a study. Number one, we have these remedial interventions and teaching at the right level type of interventions, which are very cost effective. They can get to 1 year of additional learning for students at just INR 1,000 to 2,000, and they also work in a lot of low resource sort of settings, right? So that's number one. Then we have these edtech sort of models, especially adaptive edtech, which, while effective in higher resource settings, it is the only intervention that has quantitative evidence of working in secondary grades. And because of its adaptive nature, it can also very effectively tackle the variance in learning levels of students, right? Finally, we have non-adaptive tech, which is very effective when implemented as a complement versus as a substitute to high quality instruction and with some level of supervision. So while those were some of the findings from our study, but going forward as we look to scale outcomes-based mechanisms, there is a need to do a few additional things, right? And some of these things Adil also alluded to earlier. For example, there is from a capability standpoint, we need to build the outcome readiness of implementing organization. Secondly, we need to have a much stronger evidence base. So when I say evidence base, it's not just evidence in terms of data of effectiveness, but data also about efficiency, right? So collect cost data along with outcomes data, and collect data for different segments of the population to understand differentiated impacts, right? So whether it is by gender, whether it is for rural areas, whether it is for middle and senior grades, so on and so forth. That's about it. Happy to take any questions.
Gagan, thank you very much. I think questions will have to come in the chat given the paucity of time, unfortunately. But I think both Gagan and Dayong are around to answer questions. Thank you for sort of sharing what we want to do with the data coming out of QEI. But I'm going to hand over to Ellen, who's actually joining us from very, very early in the morning from the States. And we're really grateful, Ellen, for you taking the time and the interest in doing that. I think it's 4 a.m. for you to talk about Utkrisht and the data over there and what that means for the health sector. So welcome, Ellen, for your 5 minutes of fame.
Sure, of course. Thank you for having me. And sorry about the poor lighting. It is pre-dawn here. Let's see, go to the next slide, please. My name is Ellen Smith. Oh, okay, here we go. Utkrisht was a 3-year health sector development impact bond in Rajasthan that finished last month. UBS Optimus Foundation was the investor, and USAID and MSD for Mothers were the outcome funders. I'm with Palladium, which was the implementation manager. The goal of Utkrisht was to improve the quality of care for mothers and their newborns at small private healthcare facilities in Rajasthan. Rajasthan was selected because of its persistently high maternal and newborn mortality rates. Maternal mortality is 47% higher than the national rate, and newborn mortality is 14% higher. In recent years, births have increasingly happened at healthcare facilities rather than at home, but high mortality rates have persisted. In the years before Utkrisht, an increasing proportion of births took place in private facilities. Utkrisht's quality intervention was designed to improve the quality of care for mothers who were receiving care in these private facilities. Our quality improvement work was based on 2 national certifications, NABH, or National Accreditation Board for Hospitals and Healthcare Providers, and Manyata, a maternal and newborn quality certification offered by the Federation of Obstetric and Gynecological Societies of India. We're pending final results, but our tentative results show that 405 small private healthcare facilities achieved higher quality standards in maternal and newborn health. With these achievements, the investor would receive its maximum financial return of 8% per year. Palladium and the service providers would receive a financial incentive for achieving more than the minimum number of facilities. Next slide, please. Achieving these successful results involved a high degree of adaptive management and collaborative decision-making among the Utkarsh partners. For example, when Palladium realized that not enough facilities would meet the eligibility criteria, it suggested changes to these criteria, and Utkarsh Steering Committee of partner organizations adopted the needed changes. These continuous adaptations are reflected in this graph, showing that outcomes were achieved at a slightly different pace to what was planned. Of course, the largest unexpected circumstance to arise was the COVID-19 pandemic. During the lockdown announced in March of 2020, like many others, the implementation team had to immediately pivot to remote work. Utkarsh also had to cancel a verification round, which led to a delay in outcome payments. When our verification later resumed, it too had to be changed to online rather than in person. Beyond continuing our work on maternal and newborn health during the pandemic, we also expanded our work to include COVID-19 information and protocols. We stayed in continuous communication with the enrolled facilities, often teaching them how to work remotely, which was new for most. We communicated the latest information on COVID-19, including protocols for health facilities being published by WHO and Indian governmental authorities. We coached them on topics such as setting up COVID-19 screening checkpoints, how to manage COVID-19 during maternity care, and connected facilities with without enough personal protective equipment to suppliers that had it in stock. This experience connecting small, private, and often far-flung facilities with the most up-to-date and evidence-based COVID-19 information showed us the importance of such small facilities belonging to a network. It was a happy coincidence that they were enrolled in the Utkarsh program when the pandemic hit, which allowed them to stay connected to information. As the importance of the health sector was brought to the light during the pandemic, we think this is one lesson learned. As long as many Indians continue to receive healthcare and information from independent facilities, it is vital that those facilities are linked to broader networks that can distribute information and standards, especially during a public health emergency. Next slide. Next slide. There are many, so what does this mean for the future of financing in India, and how can we build off of Utkarsh? We know that there are many standards of quality of healthcare for specific topics like maternal and newborn care that are set out by governments and also the World Health Organization. But what these guidelines do not explain is how to achieve those standards. Utkarsh successfully modeled how these existing healthcare facilities can improve their quality of care so they meet those standards. And this, we think, is where outcomes-based financing was key. We focused on achieving quality standards, not only on what the quality improvement standards are. From here, it is up to the government to decide how it would like to use these standards. For example, by requiring them to participate in insurance schemes, and if it would like to scale up similar intervention in other states. Palladium will also be taking the lessons learned from Utkarsh and applying them to an upcoming social impact bond with Pimpri Chinchwad, an impact bond that will also be in the health sector. Next slide. Thank you so much for the chance to speak today, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker now.
Thank you, Ellen, for sharing insights from Utkarsh, the COVID adaptations, as well as the way forward in Pimpri Chinchwad. Hopefully, during the breakouts, the practitioners involved in that can talk about where the learnings from Utkarsh are moving into a district and looking at health, for paying of health outcomes at the district level. So we will have that hopefully coming up. But now over to colleagues at the NSDC to talk about how they are looking at the skilling sector in India and how they're looking at government engagement on this and scale. Over to you, Avneet and Arun.
So thank you, Abha. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll quickly set the context under which, in which we went about to looking at this as a key financial instrument for outcomes. Next slide. Yeah, so just quickly background and what is the bond we are proposing to launch and the way forward. Please go ahead. Yeah, just for the, I think many of you, some of you may be aware, but we are a nodal PPP institution, and this PPP character also helps us when we talk of such kind of outcome financing. So we are set up in 2009, a decade back. So 51% is private sector and 49% is government of India. And the original mandate was to catalyze development of the skill ecosystem, fund private sector training capacity creation, and also to develop the LMIS. Next slide. So the last decade, we have done certain work which has provided the foundation for what we talk today. So we have done a lot of funding in terms of providing loans and grants and equity to various quality training institutions. We're also able to draw private sector investments in skills, created training capacity, close to around 600 training partners with training centers in each district. And today, as we talk, we have around 50 lakh training capacity per annum. 28 million candidates trained, 50% in jobs. And in terms of impact, a person who goes through the training, there's a 2 times chance that he would get employed, certified, 15% would increase rise in income, and close to 79% increase in confidence, when he actually navigates the labor market. To enable this, we have created a number of agencies, institutions across. One is the sector skill councils, 36 of them, which create the standards, a whole range of training standards, curriculum, trainers, assessors. And today we also talk about all kinds of blended learning formats. And all this is tied up through a robust technology platform. So this is the background on which we are talking of when we talk about the skill impact bond. Please go ahead. So we have identified 3 areas of focus for us in this next phase evolution. The first is to build evidence for outcome approach in skilling. As many of the speakers before me spoke about the lack of credible data, lack of evidence. So therefore, this was one of the key focus areas for us. That how do we build evidence for outcomes approach? Second is how do we create this sector? How do we make the sector attractive so that private sector capital comes in? And thirdly, what are those blended skilling models which can be scaled up, which could be effective? And we see this use of impact bonds to drive these 3 key areas for us. We believe that using this impact bond, it could help us prove effectiveness of this approach, and also provide evidence when it comes to policy making. We also hope that by the end of this bond, we would be able to draw private sector funding. And lastly, of course, as I said, while we were very focused on classroom-based training, etc., the fact that during the COVID, quite a lot of digital models emerged. So we are using this bond also to identify which are the models we need to focus on and which are the ones we can scale. Next slide. I'll hand it over to Avneet, who will speak about the bond and the way forward.
Sure. Thanks, Arun. So this bond, which we've been all working hard on and are very, very keen to launch at the earliest now, it's called the Skill India Impact Bond. And it brings together a strong consortium of partners, which includes the typical stakeholders from outcome funders to risk investors, which is the role that NSDC is playing on this bond. We have a very strong pool of service providers to help us with the implementation, and definitely the data theme and the learning agenda, which is so critical, will be managed by a very strong partner to do the MEL piece on this impact bond. Next slide, please. So the kind of things that we are trying to drive through this impact bond, anything that I say is not something that we haven't heard in the past, couple of minutes and hours that we've been doing this. So at the cost of repetition, but that's also very encouraging because it shows us that, we are going in the right direction. Specifically for skilling, it's a value chain from enrollment to training to certification to placement and retention. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to shift the outcome structure, which is at present focused on training and certification, to placement and retention. So we want to create new incentive structures in order to be able to do that, structures that are anchored on outcomes. We want to drive innovation and importantly, create proof of feasibility for national level change. The most critical aspect of the impact bond, particularly for NSDC and for our other partners, including BAT, is to make sure that the mainstreaming agenda is very strong. So it's very important for us to ensure that the proof of concept that we work on as we launch this in the coming month is really robust, and we are able to incorporate those learnings and take the skilling agenda forward by institutionalizing some of these outcomes. Next slide, please. And I think this was just, our way of trying to show where we are trying to go through this bond. So at present, like I said, we are focused mostly through the government programs, the Prime Minister's Skill Development Program, which is the flagship program of the Government of India for skilling. At the current state, people are mostly rewarded for enrollment and graduation. We are moving this paradigm to say that after implementation of the impact bond, we hope that the SIB-enabled state would focus on placement and retention instead of the focus on enrollment and graduation. And this will lead to a shift in the incentive structures. There's no other way that this can happen. And it also leads to better efficiencies. And finally, we are talking about an aspirational state post the impact bond, where the focus is on long-term outcomes, again, similar placement and retention outcomes, ensuring that the transition rates from one step to the other there's more greater efficiency created there, and also making sure that the inclusion agenda of gender and any other categories that we want to focus on is adequately built into the design. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide in terms of the mainstreaming agenda that we are aiming at by institutionalizing some of the learnings that we acquire from this impact bond into the government programs. So like I said, and a little bit of repeating again there, we want to provide proof of feasibility for the government and the broader ecosystem to shift financial incentives to placement and retention. We want to bring a gender focus to skilling. We know the current state of women's participation in the labor force in India, and there's much left to be desired there. So we want to make sure that they are included, and that leads to long-term paid employments for employment, particularly for women. We want to drive innovation and learnings to improve efficiency in the sector, which is that reduce the dropout rates. And finally, we also want to make sure that in the post-COVID world, we cater to the sectors that are most aspirational for everybody and also help serve the needs of the economy. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Abha.
Thank you, Avneet. That's quite a lot, quite quickly, and it'd be great if we can spotlight all the speakers of this session. We have 5 to 7 minutes for questions, and I can see questions on the chat on questions of, and firstly on who is going to pay for evaluation. And, perhaps this is something NSDC can talk about as we scale these conversations. What does it mean for rural, using rural data as well? And perhaps, Dalberg, you can come in. And with Utkrisht, there was a question, I think, which I'm just going to pick up in a second, but let's start, Arun. As we think about scale, we're running these sort of hard evaluations, which could be expensive on this. How do we think about scaling those evaluation processes and using of data within the NSDC, which is a semi-government organization? So you actually are well versed to think about scale on that.
Yeah, when I look at the way today we are funded, the most of the heavy lifting is done by the government in terms of the money paid per trainee for skilling. And as soon when we speak about this outcome focused financing, we see that the cost per trainee is expected to go up because there is a case for MEL, a stronger MEL, much more innovation in terms of use of technology and other things. We believe that once we are able to demonstrate results, once we're able to showcase the fact that these kind of interventions actually result in higher outcomes, we are looking at multiple blended financing models. We are seeing that it could be possible that the government could fund a base cost, and some of the cost funding could come from, say, CSR companies. And also we see some co-pay models emerging. But today, when we speak about it, we do not have the evidence to make the case to either the corporate or to the trainee that if he were to contribute to the skilling, if he were to contribute to the training cost, it would actually benefit him. We believe at the end of this bond, or even in the course of the bond, we'll be able to arrive at those right figures. And then when placed to the right audience, probably the payment or the payment for outcomes would be a much easier proposition.
Really good to hear from you, Arun, that you're sort of starting to think about the costs of it early, because that is really valuable to some of the points that both Amitabh and Adil raised with Maitri. I'm going to move to Ellen. Ellen, really lots of questions on COVID and the access question during COVID to your facilities. Would be great if you can pick that up. And then a last point to Dayong. Dayong, several questions to you on the data I think you've been picking up, but do summarize after Ellen.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wasn't sure if this question was about COVID or not. It doesn't say it is. So in terms of the general question about access to the health facilities, especially given household inequalities, that is not something that we focused on much. As you know, these outcomes-based contracts are very focused on a specific outcome. And in our case, we are focused on the quality once the women arrived at the facility. And, there's some reason to believe that that might increase access to facilities, but that was not our focus. We did that because the proportion of births that are happening in facilities throughout Rajasthan have really been increasing, but we haven't seen as fast of a decrease in mortality as we wanted. That said, I would say that once the women did arrive to the health facility, one of the aspects of care that we looked at was respectful maternity care. So that would involve how the staff treated the women and topics like if they were allowed to have a support person with them during the maternity care. In terms of COVID, of course, that created huge problems for access to the facilities. What we did do, in addition to what I mentioned, which was when we moved to the virtual way of working with the facilities, we really emphasized the infection prevention control measures, which were already part of the quality standards. And we added on some modules specific to COVID-19 to help the facilities. In terms of access to the women, for the women to the facilities, we did have a small separate grant from the UBS Optimus Foundation that supported a telehealth and telemedicine project. So we had both women could call in, and we also had the information from the facilities about who was receiving care there, maternity care or antenatal care or postnatal care. And we also reached out proactively to those women to speak with them about what kind of questions they had about their health status and questions during that time. So that was the way that we sort of addressed the problem of access to health facilities during COVID.
That's a big, deep area of concern, right? The access to health facilities during COVID. I think there's a lot we could ask you there, but given paucity of time, we have a couple of minutes. I won't dig deeper here, but maybe we can pick this up in the breakout rooms. Moving to you, Dayong, on your data, several questions on rural students and how you're considering them. Will they be left out from these digital platforms? And perhaps a minute, Dayong, how you want policymakers to use the tool you've created. Really critical that the tool doesn't only sit as research, but policymakers are able to engage with service providers with your tool. So do talk to that as well.
Sure. Yeah, so on the question of how do we ensure that these outcomes-based financing contracts actually address structural inequalities like the rural-urban divide, gender divide, and so on, I do think that there are at least two ways that can be done. One is to actually set targets, like having at least 50% of the students be women or for girls, or X percentage students with special needs and so forth, or actually pricing to allow for potentially higher costs to address some of these students, right? We saw that students in higher learning grades actually are costlier to improve than lower grades. And for rural, it could be either way, but we actually didn't have a lot of data. So I think the starting point is actually to be able to price these correctly and to avoid skimming, essentially where you're just addressing low-hanging fruit students that are easier to improve. We need to compensate accordingly, right? And to do that, we need better data that's disaggregated to understand actually the level of programming effort that needs to increase to serve these students well. And in regards to your second question, Abha, on how do we really make this tool? So we provided guidelines around what should the cost for each learning outcome be for numeracy and literacy improvements under different types of contexts. For example, I think policymakers can really look at this as a starting point to inform, okay, if I have this much budget, how should I be thinking not only about what I can procure per child, but what kind of learning outcomes and gains can I expect from my school system? And also understand what types of interventions are best suited for my context. And so do look out for guidance on not just the price per outcome, but also what are the sort of conditionalities the situations in which, depending on whether you are in a low resource setting, I think someone asked about Orissa versus Gujarat, for example, it's a great example, versus a high resource setting where you may have infrastructure access, different types of educational interventions may be more or less relevant. So look forward to sort of disseminating the report and also getting your all feedback on how to make this more useful. But definitely look at, I think, both the pricing guidelines along with under what conditions it's most effective.
Amazing. From pricing outcomes to taking it to scale to understanding the health sector, I'm really, really delighted to go back to a policymaker who's amongst us now. We have Mr. Rajaraman, Additional Secretary from the Ministry of Finance here. We really did, as we're talking about pricing, costing, paying, you can't do it without the Ministry of Finance in the room. So he's generously agreed to be in the room, talk to us about how the Ministry of Finance is thinking about this. He has huge experience in the area. In the area both of investment promotion and FDI, foreign direct investment. He's a champion of outcomes-led approaches. We're really delighted that the Impact Investors Council has got him engaged with the British Asian Trust and the Go Labs here. And we welcome your remarks. You've been listening to some of this, I know. And you've also been talking to many practitioners here, so it'll be great to hear what you have to say. We had your colleagues from NITI and Adil and Maitri from the World Bank earlier, really evangelizing for outcomes, Mr. Rajaraman, talking about how this government is really keen on I think the words were startup mentality, population scale. So I think that was the quote that is being borrowed heavily from Amitabh by the entire group. So over to you. You hold the purse strings, and actually you're the person who could help us really think about scale on this.
So thank you, Abha, and good evening to all the participants on this in this workshop. And I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. India, the government of India is very keen on, actually looking at innovations to support, better and better outcomes from the investments of made through the public exchequer. So first of all, I would like to say that it gives me great pleasure to be with all of you at this Social Outcomes Conference 2021. I've been in discussions with Mr. Pai and many other members of this group, to just brainstorm and see how some of the experience that is out there in the private sector in India as well as outside could be actually effectively tapped by the government of India for developing new instruments. So as you just said, Abha, I think Mr. Amitabh Kant and many other speakers have provided a vision on where we want to take outcomes-based scheme implementation and financing going forward. So in the Ministry of Finance, we are very keen to push the boundaries of innovation, as I just mentioned, to squeeze better outcomes from every rupee that is being spent. So better outcomes provide greater economic and social value for the money spent. It also raises the trust and confidence of taxpayers in particular and citizens in general on the way tax money is spent. So we believe that these innovations are very important for us. And the public sector can learn from a lot of these tools that have been spent. So we have been studying the evidence from global markets, especially the experience on impact bonds from the United Kingdom and the US and many other developed geographies. So we believe that social and development impact bonds can be powerful tools to crowd in additional capital into social and infrastructure services. So these are very important given the fact that the deadline for meeting the SDGs is less than a decade away. So I'm happy that the evidence is being presented in today's workshop from the Indian market as well. So India has been a good sandbox for testing various innovative approaches, and outcomes-based approaches is also an important part of that. So there have been a few projects funded by multilateral agencies in India where outcome-based instruments like pay for performance have been deployed. These have provided some experience of outcome focus to start with. The government has also provided an enabling policy environment, and by adopting certain tools like outcome budgeting and so on and so forth. So, where there is an output-outcome framework using which schemes are evaluated and a report is placed in Parliament. So, this is an initial way in which I think the drive towards outcomes is happening. So we need to move to the next phase where we can look at possible instruments like what has been discussed during the last hour or so, and perhaps in your own as part of this workshop. So we need to actually build market structures and frameworks that bring in more standardization and data-driven approaches to the impact sector, including the creation of a social stock exchange, which have been announced by the government. So we also, incidentally, we also moved to an outcomes-focused implementation of schemes for the aspirational districts. Now, one of the largest municipalities in India also announced a social impact bond earlier this year to improve outcomes in primary health. So all these indicate our willingness to move from being an interested partner to be an active payer for outcomes. So, but we need to actually have more pilots to add to the body of evidence, especially in the Indian context. So there is a need for going by the existing evidence that we have. It's clear that there is a need for a transparent framework for design, development, issue, and redemption of these social impact bonds. Essentially, as it involves private sector players, both the investors and the implementers. A PPP framework for outcome funding needs to be developed, especially in the context of social impact bonds, in order that there is a certainty over the entire contract, contracts which are put in place. So this would enable investors to come forward to subscribe to these bonds without hesitation. Developing strong contracts that are fair and balanced is also critical. Besides that, I also feel that we need to have strong public sector issuers or counterparties. Here, like for instance, we just saw a presentation from NSDC. So we need a similar kind of strong public sector counterparties who have got the legal and commercial capacity to implement such kind of complex instruments. So in addition to that, given the fact that this whole scheme would work on measurement of outcomes, so there is also a need for a clear methodological design for identifying the KPIs and also the measurements, so that there is the unnecessary disputes don't arise out of such contracts. And also, on one side we should be avoiding disputes. On the other side, we should also be avoiding perverse effects such as screaming, parking, or cherry picking, and so on and so forth. Some of which was just described during the discussions before my intervention. So we also need to develop appropriate outcome financing instruments that are cost-effective and scalable. Essentially, in some studies which I have read, especially by the OECD and others, have shown that SIBs have been costly instruments. So they have entailed significant transaction costs that stakeholders need to consider before embarking on them. So policymakers need to evaluate carefully on what is the value added for implementing an SIB. Obviously, you'll be getting better outcomes. So in the net, whether this is a more beneficial in terms of cost-benefit ratio is something that we need to look at. So I think we need to gather more evidence. But I'm sure that as more and more SIBs develop and more experiences comes about in our system, and the process of establishing running an SIB becomes far more streamlined, more technology comes into it, etc., then I guess probably the expense ratios would probably come down compared to, say, the administrative costs that one would incur in a business as usual public sector implementation. So I think these cost comparisons also need to be factored in while making a right choice of the instruments. So, how do we go forward? I think, therefore, I believe that we need to identify certain specific sectors and schemes, like the Prime Minister's Kaushal Vikas Yojana, on which a presentation was made, that can be amenable and to effective and efficient use of social impact bonds, and they are scaling up. So, therefore, I think maybe there is a need for collective action in this regard. So we welcome partnerships from organizations like Government Outcomes Lab, World Bank, universities, and other stakeholders to join hands along with the Ministry of Finance and the NITI Aayog in kind of fine-tuning this approach and see where this should apply, in what manner should we apply, so that we get the best possible results. So I'm very happy and excited to see the upcoming pilots which are being launched by local governments like Pune and like Pimpri Chinchwad and the National Skills Development Corporation, and hope that these generate valuable evidence that can help us to scale these instruments. So I look forward to active discussions in this conference and also offline, and perhaps we can give some shape to some of the ideas that have been thrown up as part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a clear setting the way forward. You were going to end the conference. I think you've actually given us thought for taking into the breakout room. You've talked about specific sectors, the evidence and schemes, so it's at bigger scale, sort of templatizing, making sure it's not costs not being on individual structures, so it's expensive. You've talked about the use of data and better and more cheaper verification, so it doesn't become a noose around people's neck. I think those are all bullet points we're going to streamline into the breakout rooms. Mr. Rajaram, thank you so much for being so open and candid that actually this is a thing we have to do together and we've got to work collectively. I think practitioners in this room will be happy to hear from you. And I hope you have lots of emails and phone calls from them, picking up on several calls to action that you made. With that, I'm going to take a bit of a break in the session. We've all been going from the UK time, I think for over an hour and a bit. I think we'll give Mara a 5-minute break before the breakouts. So people will then be split into rooms, which will come back and report back to the plenary that you will lead, and then we will close. Is that fair? Do you want to add anything, Mara?
No, I will give an introduction to the breakout room when we come back. So take 5 minutes break and we will reconvene. I explain what happens. And as I join you to thank this thought-provoking conversation, because there is a clearly appetite and ambition to improve, but now we need to talk about how. And so this breakout room are the opportunity to really dig deep and think, what is the next action? How do we pick up on the challenges?
Absolutely, Mara. We'll also pick up several questions on equity, on data that came up, and maybe the call to action for us and you is to think about those questions and taking it away for a year later to see how we made progress as well.
Is the plan.
Thanks, great.